Empathy seems like something that's about the other person, and it very much is. But there are so many personal benefits to empathy that it makes sense to pay attention. By leveling up your own empathy, you can improve your communication and avoid so many misunderstandings. You can also improve the way you regulate your own emotional responses. And when you upgrade your empathy, you'll find that people are much more likely to want to help you or cooperate with you when you need them to cooperate. So in general, your life just gets easier the more empathetic you are to other people. It's funny how it works that way. And this seems to be something that the most empathetic people already know. And that's why I wanted to look at the 5 habits of highly empathetic people today. Let's get to it. Welcome to the Common Ego community. My name is Christina, and on this channel we talk about emotional abuse, spirituality, self-development, and more. If those topics interest you, I suggest you subscribe because you can expect a whole lot more content like this. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you'll be notified whenever I post new content. This way you won't miss a thing. Okay, so what is empathy? In this video, we're going to be talking about emotional empathy or affective empathy. There are 3 types of empathy, but we're just going to be covering that type. And when you hear the word empathy, that's the type that most people are talking about. Empathy is the ability to step into someone else's shoes, aiming to understand their feelings and perspectives, and to use that understanding to guide our actions. That's a quote from an article about empathy in Greater Good magazine. I'll link to it below. Now, empathy is very different from sympathy, although they're sometimes confused. Sometimes when people mean to be empathetic, they're actually being sympathetic. So what's the difference? According to Brene Brown, empathy drives connection and sympathy drives disconnection. So we just looked at the definition of empathy. That's putting yourself into someone else's shoes, digging within yourself to find a common ground so that you can connect with someone else. Sympathy is essentially just feeling sorry for someone else. It's not about connecting with them. It's just feeling pity. And now that we've covered the difference, I want to ask you, how often have you ever wanted sympathy in your life? Most people never do. Most people really don't appreciate sympathy as much as the person who's giving it seems to think that they're going to. And one more thing I want to mention about empathy before I jump into the 5 habits of empathic people. That one thing is that empathy is dynamic. So empathy can change even within the same person from situation to situation, mood to mood, moment to moment. So when I talk about the 5 habits of highly empathetic people, I'm not talking about some perfect people who always show empathy. What we're really talking about is people who are more empathic than the average person. Or we can just look at these as 5 empathic behaviors. I want to be clear that this isn't about holding ourselves up to some high standard or comparing ourselves to anyone else. Like I said, empathy is dynamic. So you may look at someone else who's not being empathetic in the moment, but maybe they're really a very empathetic person. They're just having a bad day. So it's really pointless to compare your empathy with somebody else. But nonetheless, these habits that we're about to cover are great reminders of how we can show empathy, how we can show more empathy even when it's difficult in our everyday lives. So the first habit of a highly empathetic person is that they avoid stereotypes and preconceived notions. So highly empathic people or highly empathetic people like to form their own opinions because even if they know something about somebody that is true, that's not all of the person. There is more to that person. And somebody who is highly empathetic knows that. And more than that, they're going to try to find that common ground so that they can connect with the person. Because sometimes it's really difficult to connect with people who are very different from us or who seem very different from us. But there's always common ground. Most of us are capable of empathy. So even if that's your only common ground, if you're both practicing empathy, then that's a good place to start. Of course, this doesn't mean that somebody who is highly empathetic is going to try to find common ground with everyone. It doesn't mean that somebody who's highly empathetic is going to like everyone or want to spend time with everyone. But they're more likely to get to know the person before they make that decision. So the second habit of highly empathetic people is that they are active listeners. They practice active listening more often than not. So active listening is about actively listening to the other person. But it's more difficult than it sounds, and it's more involved than it sounds, because it involves actually letting that person make their point and accepting it as is. So it's not about jumping to conclusions. It's not about listening to the first sentence and then deciding for them what their point was. And it's not about thinking about what you're going to say next. Somebody who's practicing active listening is not only going to be patient, but they are going to be non-judgmental. So even if they don't like what the person is saying, they will hear them out, and they'll ask questions if they don't understand. Active listening also involves often repeating the point back just to make sure that you're on the same page. Now, when somebody is not being empathetic to somebody else who's talking, they might talk over them. They might pick a little small part of what they said and decide that that's what they want to talk about. And so they derail the conversation, and the other person has to go to great lengths to get it back on track. They might be jumping to one-up the person in conversation. Oh, well, you had that. I had this 10 times worse or 10 times better. And somebody who is not being an empathetic listener might act bored or try to rush the person who's speaking to make their point. Now, interestingly enough, if you've been around here for a while and you've watched a few videos, you've probably also encountered somebody who's highly narcissistic and who uses these tactics often in conversation. And somebody who's highly empathetic is not necessarily going to give someone who is emotionally abusive or somebody who has shown that their behavior is toxic, they're not necessarily going to give them the platform to speak. They're not going to actively listen to everyone, but they are going to actively listen to the people they choose to speak with, the people they choose to have conversations with. It's all about making choices and setting boundaries. And that brings me to the third habit, which is that highly empathetic people they tend to be more present in the moment with the people who they choose to spend their time with. So they're not going to be checking their phones, they're not going to be zoning out or people watching while you're spending time with a highly empathetic person. I think as a society, we're starting to lose this. It's another empathetic habit that's falling by the wayside. It's a natural consequence of shorter attention spans and technology addictions. And I found that personally, it's a lot easier to spend time in the present moment with someone you haven't seen in a while. So if you're meeting with an old friend, or even if you have an appointment with somebody, it's easier when you know that there's a set time that you're going to start and finish that engagement. But it tends to get more difficult when we're talking about the people you spend the most time with, because with that, you're balancing time for you and time for them. And usually it all ends up getting muddled together, and we don't end up spending as much time in the present moment with the people who really matter. Personally, I found it's helpful to actually schedule some time to have that quality time with those people who are really important to us. So the fourth habit of a highly empathetic person is that they will pick up on verbal and nonverbal cues that you're giving them, and they'll use those powers for good instead of evil. They'll use those cues to make you feel more comfortable, to help them understand where you're coming from. Even if you're in a complex situation, somebody who's highly empathetic, if they say something that makes you uncomfortable, or if they say something to upset you, they're probably going to redirect a little bit, because they don't actually want to hurt your feelings, and they probably also know that that's not productive either, because it's easy to spiral down when you start hurting somebody's feelings. You hurt their feelings, then they hurt your feelings, and then it becomes a fight and not a productive conversation. Now, manipulative people are also good at picking up on nonverbal cues, and I have some videos about manipulative tactics that kind of cover this. So I'm going to link to those in the card and the description. But again, the empathetic person is using those powers for good and not evil. So the fifth habit is that a highly empathetic person will pause to reflect on what you're saying and try to understand your perspective, even if they don't agree with you. And we see so often on social media these days that people just end up talking at each other, and that's never going to be productive. It's just a bunch of people who are talking at each other and accomplishing nothing but hurting the other person's feelings. And as a society, we kind of seem to have become okay with this. But the real challenge here is that in order for those conversations to become productive, both people need to become empathetic. So both people need to pause and reflect and try to understand the other person's perspective. They never need to agree, but they also do need to lose that goal of changing somebody else's mind. If only one person is empathetic in the conversation, then it's still going to turn into an argument, because the person who's trying to understand the other person's perspective will still have their own views, and the other person is just going to see it as an attack. So those are the 5 habits of highly empathetic people. I'm sure you can relate to one, if not all of them, but like I said, empathy is dynamic. There are times when empathy is really difficult. And those are the times that I personally need to work on. And I think probably everybody does. None of us are perfect. And these habits definitely serve as a reminder to me that I need to choose empathy more often. So if you found this video helpful at all, please do hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more videos on empathy, please do let me know, because I'd love to create them. It's honestly a fascinating topic for me, and I think it's really important. There's a ton more to say, but that's all I'm going to say for right now, and I'll see you next time.